I'm Nora Hale. 34, kneeling on a cold roof with a strand of Christmas lights biting into my gloves when I hear my mother's voice float up through the open garden window, bright as a bell and sharp as a tack, saying, "I think she believes this earns her a place." The wind pushes fur-scented air against my face, and my sister laughs below the kind of laugh people use when they think they're safe. I stop moving one boot on a shingle, one knee pressed to the grit, and I realize what they mean by place isn't a seat at the table, it's the curb. Someone says once the title's clean, she's gone, and the words settle like frost. My hammer slips, rattles down, and the noise startles a bird from the maple we planted when I was 10. I picture every receipt I've saved, every weekend I traded for sweat, every dollar of the $64,700 I poured into these walls. The lights flicker in my hands, red to green to white, and I decide I will not pretend I didn't hear them. When my mother calls up, "Be careful, dear, we wouldn't want you to fall," I tell her I'm fine, and it's the first time I know I'm not. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had to stand your ground with family, tap that like and subscribe so this story finds the folks who need it. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, in a cedar-sided house that creaked when the rain moved, in the kind of place where you could tell the hour by the smell of coffee and sawdust. My father, Robert, taught economics at the university and believed in numbers that added up and rules that didn't bend. My mother, Diane, believed in presentation, polished silver, pressed linens, and a smile that could hold a room still. I was the kid who followed the sound of a sander more than a violin, who learned to read grain patterns before I cared about dresses, and who felt steady any time there was wood under my hands. The lessons at our table were simple work. Hard, don't complain, keep your word, and I took them as if they were carved into oak. When I was old enough, I turned weekend repairs into a small restoration business and built it piece by piece, returning dignity to porches and staircases other people had given up on. 3 winters back, my father sat across from me in my cramped office, his tie askew, looking like a man who'd run out of easy answers. Mom was facing a health scare, he said, and the house needed serious work if we were going to keep it in the family. If I came home to help, I wouldn't be doing it for free. He promised equity when the renovations were complete, 30% of the home a fair exchange for labor, and materials, put it in writing over email, and told me he'd back me if there were questions. I packed my tools, told Tess I'd be splitting time for a while, and moved into my old room with the dent in the baseboard from a childhood headboard and a window that still stuck after the first cold snap. The plan was straightforward: stabilize the foundation, update the kitchen, bring back the woodwork, and keep receipts for every screw and sheet of drywall. The cost would land on my ledger until the title changed hands. Then, as promised, that ledger would be cleared with equity. It was a different world from the tidy book of business I'd been building. Clients in town paid invoices on schedule and brought muffins when they were thrilled. At home, invoices became family favors, and the word gift slid into conversations like it had always belonged there. I drove Mom to appointments and picked up prescriptions, then came back to strip paint from banisters and sand balusters until the edges felt right under my fingertips. The work was beautiful, hand-cut trim in the sunroom, a wraparound porch that no longer sagged, a kitchen island shaped from reclaimed oak, and every time I finished a room, Mom stood in the doorway and smiled for the neighbors. The compliments came easily. The respect did not. It was small things at first, like someone moving my square to the wrong side of the toolbox or a careful sketch finding a coffee ring on it the next morning, and I told myself families are messy and progress never happens neat. I kept my ledgers anyway. I photographed every receipt and backed them up twice. I wrote down hours, materials, and the market value for comparable work, not because I didn't trust my father, but because I understood houses and the way people forget what it took to make them sturdy. Walt at the lumberyard printed me a running account of materials. Tess convinced a photographer to document before and afters for our portfolio. On good days, I believed all of that would be enough proof of good faith, proof of skill, proof of a promise. On quieter nights when a floorboard groaned in an empty hallway and the house breathed like an animal settling into the dark, I reminded myself that numbers and honesty were the only anchors I could count on. The week the Christmas boxes came down from the attic, an envelope from attorney Raymond Carver appeared on the hall table. Cream paper with my name on the front and my mother's neat note on top. "We should talk through the future of the house next Thursday. Everyone will be here." I tucked it into a folder and went back to hanging lights, telling myself a family meeting meant order, clarity, and a timeline at last. Then the window was open, the voices rose up, and the shape of that meeting changed. I didn't answer anything with anger. I finished the string across the gable and climbed down because, even if the foundation was cracking, the lights ought to glow for the neighbors. That night, I set my receipts in a tighter stack, opened my father's old email, and read the line that promised equity until the words steadied my pulse. I also powered up a small camera and placed it in the corner of my room, pointed at the door. Because the work of making things true sometimes begins with simply seeing what is. By Thursday, they wanted the title clean. By Thursday, I planned to bring a cleaner story than the one they were telling. The day after I set that small camera in the corner of my room, the house felt different. Quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves had caught wind of my discovery. I tried to keep my rhythm the same: up early, coffee with Dad, before his morning walk, then out to the workshop or up on a ladder by 9, but the air between us all was too still. Every voice from downstairs sounded deliberate, too careful not to echo. By Wednesday, I was halfway through the trim work in the upstairs hallway when Mom called me down to her office. Her tone was light, almost friendly, which meant trouble. She was seated behind her desk when I walked in, Lena standing near the window, with her arms crossed, and Mark leaning casually against the wall, his suit jacket still buttoned as if we were in a courtroom. "Sit down, honey," Mom said, motioning to the chair across from her. "We need to go over some family matters." The framed certificates and old family photos on the wall gleamed in the afternoon light, but none of them included me. I sat down slowly, brushing drywall dust from my jeans. Mom folded her hands, her manicure catching the light. "About the renovations, you've done such lovely work." She began, smiling just enough to feel rehearsed. "But I think there's been some confusion about what's yours and what belongs to the family." Lena nodded, not meeting my eyes. Mark slid a folder across the desk toward me. "We've been documenting your projects as voluntary contributions," he said smoothly. "For tax purposes, of course. That way no one's liable for unexpected expenses." I opened the folder. The paperwork was detailed: each room I'd remodeled, listed under gifts of service, every receipt stripped of its dollar value. I felt the heat rise behind my ears as I flipped through the pages. "You mean the work I've done here for 3 years?" I said, keeping my voice even. $64,700 worth of labor and materials, that's all considered a gift. Now, Mark's expression didn't change. "That's correct. You've lived here rent-free, haven't you? Legally speaking, that's an exchange of value." Mom leaned back in her chair, pleased with herself. "We're all family, dear. But since your father and I decided to move forward with selling next spring, we need to be clear on what's official and what's sentimental." I looked at her, trying to decide which part of that sentence stung more: the sale or the certainty that she'd made this decision without ever intending to tell me. Selling. The word came out before I could stop it. "Dad promised me equity when this was done." Mom's eyes flickered for just a second. "Your father isn't here right now, Nora," she said, smoothing a sheet of paper. "And promises made in conversation aren't binding." Mark's tone sharpened. "Without a signed agreement, there's nothing enforceable. It's best to avoid conflict and let the process run its course." Lena's voice, soft and practiced, followed his. "You've done beautiful work, Nora, but you're not really planning to live here forever, are you? You deserve your own space." The room spun for a moment. The three of them were perfectly aligned, one speaking logic, one sympathy, one silence, and the weight of their calm was more crushing than if they'd shouted. I stood up, pushing the folder gently back across the desk. "I'll need time to review this," I said. "Of course," Mom replied with a thin smile. "But don't take too long. We've invited the estate attorney for dinner next week. It's time to get everything organized." That evening, I sat at the small desk in my room and opened my laptop. My fingers trembled as I searched through the backups, finding the email from Dad dated 3 years earlier. It was short and direct: "As discussed, your investment of labor and materials in the property will be compensated with 30% equity upon completion of major renovations." I read it 3 times, saving it again to a new folder labeling it Proof. The hammer from my earlier project sat beside the keyboard, the handle still warm from my hands. I stared at the grain in the wood until my breathing evened out. By morning, I was back to work on the sunroom, installing the last section of molding along the windowsill. I'd always loved that room, the way the afternoon light fell in strips across the floorboards, the smell of cedar from the planters I built. But when I came down for lunch, I found Lena standing in that same space directing a delivery crew to move in an antique writing desk. "Mom said we could start using this room," she said without turning. "Mark and I want to make it our study." I looked at the desk, then at my drafting table shoved into the corner. "That's my workspace," I said. "Not anymore," she replied. I left before I said something I couldn't take back. Outside, I sat in my truck, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. I watched them through the window, Lena in her tailored sweater, marking spots on the wall where she wanted new shelves, and Mom nodding approvingly. Every corner of that house had my fingerprints on it, and suddenly none of it belonged to me. The next afternoon, while I was restocking supplies at the lumberyard, Walt came over, lowering his voice. "Your dad stopped by yesterday," he said. "Asked for material totals for everything you've ordered since moving home." My stomach dropped. "Did he say why?" Walt shook his head. "He just said it was time he knew the truth." By Thursday, the letter from Attorney Carver arrived: formal dinner, full family attendance review of property ownership. The timing was too neat, too deliberate. That night, I found my toolbox rearranged again. The measuring tape I kept coiled on the left was tangled on the right, and my favorite hammer was missing altogether. I found it in the shed later, the handle sticky as if someone had dipped it in syrup. I washed it in the sink, dried it, and locked it in my truck. 2 days later, my renovation plans for the master bath were soaked through the ink running in blue streaks. Mom appeared in the doorway, coffee cup in hand. "Oh dear," she said lightly. "How clumsy of me." I didn't answer. I just folded the ruined paper carefully and threw it away. That night, I adjusted the angle of my camera to face my door and checked that the red light stayed on. The recordings didn't lie. Each morning brought a new small sabotage, a missing tool, a misplaced receipt, a door left ajar that I knew I'd locked. I cataloged them all, time-stamped and labeled. In the process of searching for a missing invoice, I found something else entirely: a shoebox tucked behind my father's reference books, filled with old envelopes addressed to Mom in handwriting I didn't recognize. The return address read Dean Harrington. The first letter I opened mentioned a weekend at Cannon Beach, dated the same weekend Dad attended a conference years ago. The next one included references to financial transfers. I stopped reading. The truth was clear enough. By the time Sunday arrived, the tension in the house hummed like an exposed wire. Even small talk over breakfast carried the weight of secrets. Mom reminded me again about Thursday's dinner, her tone cheerful, her eyes sharp. "I hope you won't make this difficult," she said. "Everyone's expecting a pleasant evening." I nodded, pretending to agree. Pleasant was one word for it. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, my ledger's open receipts spread out in perfect rows. I'd always believed that precision was a kind of honesty, that if you documented things clearly, fairness would follow. But sitting there under the dim light, listening to the soft creak of the hallway above, I realized that fairness didn't happen by accident. You had to make it happen even if it meant standing alone. I closed the binder, labeled it with a single word, Proof, and slid it into my briefcase. Outside, snow had started to fall, settling softly over the porch I rebuilt last spring. Each flake caught the glow from the window like a small, quiet promise. In 4 days, we'd sit down for dinner with the attorney, and every lie that had been built into this house would have to face the light. I wasn't sure yet how it would unfold, but I knew one thing for certain: this time I would not be the one caught off guard. The week crawled forward each day, feeling heavier than the one before it. The cameras I'd installed caught little things: someone rifling through my toolbox, the faint creak of my bedroom door in the middle of the night, but I said nothing. The footage was clear enough for me to know it wasn't my imagination, and that was what mattered. I kept my face neutral at breakfast, drank my coffee, and tried to match my mother's cheerful tone when she asked about the final touches on the house. But every word between us carried a quiet edge, a tension so thick it hummed through the air. By Wednesday afternoon, I drove out to the lumberyard for one last load of trim pieces, anything to get away from the house for a few hours. Walt met me near the loading bay, his flannel sleeves rolled up and a concerned look on his face. "You holding up okay?" he asked quietly, glancing toward my truck. I nodded, trying to. He hesitated before saying, "Your dad stopped by again. Wanted to confirm totals for everything you've ordered." I stared at him, the words sticking. "Did he say what for?" Walt shook his head. He didn't explain, but he seemed serious. That was all he needed to say. The way Walt watched me like someone waiting for bad weather to hit told me everything I needed to know. That evening, the kitchen smelled of roast chicken and rosemary when I came in from the garage. Mom stood at the counter arranging roses into a vase, the same white ones she'd always saved for company. "You're quiet tonight," she said without looking up. "I just want everything to go smoothly tomorrow." I watched her hands trim the stems, smooth and steady. "It's just dinner, Mom." She smiled faintly. "Oh, Nora, don't make a scene. This house was never going to be yours. You were helping family the way daughters should." Her voice stayed calm, but it hit like a nail driven straight through wood. I didn't answer. Instead, I set my tool belt on the counter beside her, the weight of it thudding against the marble. "Family doesn't use each other," I said quietly. She looked up, then surprised by the steadiness in my tone. "You've always been so dramatic," she replied, exhaling as if I'd proven her point. "This is why we couldn't trust you with inheritance matters." I looked at her, really looked, and saw something I hadn't before. Not anger or guilt, just a practiced calm, the kind people wear when they've already decided they're right. Later that night, I called Tess. Her voice on the other end was the only thing that steadied me. "You've got documentation for everything she asked, every receipt, every photo I said, and Dad's email." She was quiet for a moment. "Then make sure it's backed up somewhere safe. Tomorrow's about facts, not feelings." I knew she was right. I backed up every file again, photos of the renovations, copies of receipts, screenshots of text exchanges, and stored a copy in the cloud, another on a flash drive I tucked into my pocket. Then I went downstairs, double-checked the locks, and tried to sleep. Sleep didn't come easy. Around 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. The motion camera on my nightstand blinked red, recording. The steps paused, then retreated. I waited until the sound faded before checking the footage. It was Lena standing under the porch light holding something in her hands, a folder maybe. She glanced toward my window, then slipped back inside. I set the phone face down and closed my eyes, but the image stayed with me until morning. The next day passed in silence. The house looked perfect, table set, with china candles, trimmed chairs, aligned as if we were posing for a magazine. Every detail was exactly how my mother liked it. By late afternoon, I heard cars pulling into the drive. I was upstairs sorting my documents into one neat stack when Dad's voice carried through the hallway. It was the first time I'd heard him speak to Mom in weeks. "We'll talk about this tonight," he said flatly. I couldn't hear her answer. I came down when the doorbell rang again. Walt was the first to arrive, a binder tucked under his arm, followed by Tess, and a photographer from her firm, a woman named Marcy. Mom's expression faltered for just a second when she saw them. "I didn't realize we'd invited more guests," she said, her voice sugar smooth. "They're here to help with documentation," I replied evenly. "You said everything needed to be organized." Walt opened his binder on the counter. "Complete records of materials purchased for this house from 2022 to now," he said, nodding to me, "with current valuations." For the first time in years, I felt taller standing in that room. Mom's usual confidence seemed to flicker, her gaze darting toward the living room where Lena and Mark whispered near the fireplace. I met her eyes, and for once she looked away first. I carried my laptop to the dining table, setting it beside my stack of folders. The chairs were already arranged for dinner, Dad at the head, Mom to his right, Lena and Mark beside her with one empty seat left for me. I didn't sit yet. When everyone had arrived, the conversation started, small talk of weather, traffic, harmless pleasantries. But underneath it all was a low current of unease. Dad kept glancing toward me, his expression unreadable. When Raymond Carver, the attorney, entered, Mom greeted him with her brightest smile. "Raymond, I'm so glad you could make it. Let's finalize everything tonight." He nodded politely and took a seat. I noticed how his gaze lingered on the folders in front of me. Dinner itself passed in fragments, the scrape of silverware, the occasional clink of glasses. I barely tasted a thing. My thoughts stayed fixed on the laptop beside me, the evidence that could either set things straight or tear this family apart for good. When dessert plates were cleared, Mom turned toward the attorney. "Shall we begin?" she said. "We're all here and it's time we moved forward." Dad's voice cut through the hum of conversation. "Before we do," he said slowly, "I'd like to hear what Nora has prepared." The room fell silent. Mom blinked, her smile tightening. "Charles, we don't need to drag." He raised a hand. "Let's hear her out." I opened my laptop and connected it to the television mounted on the far wall, the one I'd installed myself the year before. The screen lit up with a spreadsheet, every renovation listed by date, cost, and the increase in property value it created. "These are my records," I said, my voice steady. "I've invested $64,700 into this home over the last 3 years. Each improvement has been documented, photographed, and verified by local appraisers. I clicked through the images, before and after photos of the porch, the kitchen, the bathrooms, every detail visible under perfect light." Mom's face paled. Lena shifted in her seat. Mark leaned back, crossing his arms. "Additionally," I continued, "I have an email from Dad confirming that my investment would be compensated with 30% equity upon completion." The words hung there, simple and solid. For a moment no one moved. Then Mom stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Nora has always misunderstood things. She's blowing family discussions out of proportion." Dad didn't look at her. He opened a folder of his own and slid several papers across the table toward Raymond. "I've been reviewing the family finances myself," he said quietly, "and I found some transfers that need explaining." Mom's voice wavered. "Charles, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," he interrupted. "You've been transferring money to Dean Harrington for years, including funds that were meant for Nora's equity." The room went still. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to pause between ticks. Raymond cleared his throat, scanning the documents. "Given this information," he said carefully, "I can't in good conscience finalize any transfer of ownership tonight." Mom sank back into her chair, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Everything I'd built, every plank, every nail, every hour I'd spent doubting myself was right there on the screen, undeniable. The silence stretched until Raymond gathered his papers and said, "We'll need to review this further." Dad gave a small nod. "We're not done here," he said, looking directly at Mom. "But tonight the truth belongs to everyone." As people began to stand, the tension still held thick and unmoving. I turned off the screen, closed my laptop, and exhaled. For the first time in months, the air in that house felt breathable. Outside, snow kept falling in quiet sheets covering the footprints leading to the porch. Tomorrow would bring its own reckoning, but tonight the story was no longer just theirs to tell. After the dinner ended, the house stayed unnaturally still. No one said goodbye. They just drifted off in silence, as if speaking might make the night real. I lingered long after the others had gone, collecting my folders and unplugging my laptop, the sound of the cord scraping the table louder than it should have been. Dad stood at the window, the reflection of snowlight softening his expression. "We'll handle this, Nora," he said quietly. "It's not over." Then he took his coat and left without another word. The rest of that night felt suspended in air. Mom disappeared upstairs, and I stayed in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The roses she'd arranged earlier drooped toward the table petals, loosening one by one. I didn't sleep. By sunrise, I'd already packed my truck with the binders, the camera, and my tool belt. I couldn't stand the smell of her perfume in the hallway any longer. 3 days passed before anyone spoke again. When Mom finally cornered me in the kitchen, the tension came dressed in silk and perfume. She leaned against the counter I'd built last spring, her voice low but controlled. "You embarrassed this family," she said, "dragging your father and me through paperwork in front of guests." What were you thinking? I looked at her, trying to see if she believed her own words. I was thinking about the truth, I said. Her smile flickered. Truth is perspective, Nora. You made your choice. I just hope you can live with it. By afternoon, Lena showed up, her husband close behind. We need to talk, she said, blocking the doorway. I motioned toward the table, and the three of them sat like they were taking shifts in some quiet performance. Mark unfolded a sheet of paper and smoothed it across the table. We've discussed this with your mother, he said. We're offering a compromise. 15% equity final. It saves everyone time and expense. I studied the numbers at the bottom of the page. 15% less than half of what I'd been promised, less than what I'd already spent. Mom crossed her arms. It's generous considering everything we've done for you. Lena looked nervous, her gaze flicking to Mark, then to me. It keeps the family together, she murmured. I closed the folder. And what if I say no? Mark didn't hesitate. Then we litigate. I don't recommend that path. Mom softened her voice, then placing a hand on my arm. Honey, this isn't about money. It's about moving forward. I raised you alone most of those years, remember? I just wanted what's best for both of you. Her hand trembled slightly as she spoke, as if she'd rehearsed the gesture and still couldn't make it convincing. You raised me to keep my word, I said quietly, and to keep records. I'm doing both. For a long moment, no one spoke. The clock in the hallway ticked loud enough to fill the space. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and placed it on the counter. Since the night I heard you through the garden window, I said, I've been recording our conversations. Mom's face drained of color. Lena went still. Mark straightened in his chair, his eyes sharp now. You can't do that, he said quickly. It's illegal without consent. I tapped the screen twice. Their voices filled the kitchen, the faint hum of that first December night. The window opened, their words clear as glass. Once she's gone, we can renovate properly. Get a real contractor. Charles never has to know how much she spent. I pressed pause. The silence that followed was complete. Mom's mouth opened, but no sound came. Lena covered her face. Mark's jaw tightened, calculation flickering behind his eyes. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I'm not looking for revenge, I said. I just wanted to be sure no one rewrites what happened here. At that moment, the back door opened and Dad stepped inside. He looked older than I remembered lines, deeper eyes tired, but clear. He carried a manila envelope and set it on the counter. It's done, he said. My portion of the property rights is transferred to Nora. Mom spun toward him. You can't just... It's done, he repeated. His voice was quiet, but it landed like a hammer on stone. No one moved. Then I turned to the cabinet by the window and began removing my tools. The sound of metal against wood filled the silence. I carried each piece out to the truck hammer's chisels levels, then came back for the furniture I'd built, the side table, the lamp, the carved mantel. Piece by piece, I took what was mine. Mom watched from the doorway, her face pale. You can't take that, she said. It's part of the house. I unscrewed the last brass fitting on the mantel, revealing the cracked wood beneath. Not anymore, I said. When I stepped outside, snow was falling again, thin and steady. Walt's pickup waited by the curb. He helped load the last of my things, neither of us speaking until the truck bed was full. You did the right thing, he said finally. I nodded, tightening the strap over the mantel. From inside the house came the muffled sound of raised voices, Mom's sharp tone, Dad's low, unshaken replies. We drove off in silence. The town looked softer under the snowlights glowing through windows, smoke curling from chimneys. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd left that house without checking behind me. When we reached my new place, a small craftsman bungalow off Willamette Street, I stood in the empty living room for a while, surrounded by my own work. The smell of pine and old varnish felt honest grounding. Walt handed me my keys. You'll make it beautiful, he said. Then he left me there, the door clicking softly behind him. That night, I unpacked the carved mantel first. I leaned it against the wall near the fireplace and sat on the floor beside it. My hands were raw from the cold, but I didn't mind. The house creaked gently around me, alive in its own way. I thought about what Dad had done, signing over his share, standing up when it mattered, and wondered if the fracture between us could ever fully mend. A week later, Raymond Carver called. "Your mother and sister have retained separate counsel," he said. "They're requesting a settlement discussion." I thanked him and asked for time to review my options. As I hung up, sunlight broke through the frost on the window, scattering gold across the unfinished floors. It caught on the brass inlays of my tools, small, bright reminders of the work ahead. The days that followed were quiet. I sanded, repaired, measured, and rebuilt one board at a time. Each task steadied me the hum of the sander, the grain of the wood rising under my palms, the certainty of progress measured in inches instead of arguments. At night, I sat at my desk and watched the snow fall outside, thinking about what rebuilding really meant, not just walls or windows, but the space inside you that finally feels like your own. When the phone rang again the next morning, I knew without checking that it would be my mother. I let it go to voicemail. There would be time for that conversation eventually, but not today. I had a new project, starting a full restoration for a historical society downtown, and for the first time in years, I was working for myself on my own terms. The sound of saws started up across the neighborhood, echoing through the cold air. I opened the window just a little, letting the noise drift in. It reminded me of home, of beginnings, of how creation and loss can sometimes sound the same before they turn into something stronger. I went back to work, steady hands, clean measurements, each strike of the hammer marking the start of a foundation that no one could take from me again. By the end of January, the house that once echoed with arguments had fallen silent. Snow still clung to the edges of the roof, and every time I passed by on my way to the job site, it looked more like a museum than a home clean, untouched, and hollow. I'd started waking before sunrise again, the way I used to when my business was just beginning. It felt good to move with purpose, to hear the hum of power tools instead of raised voices. My hands remembered the rhythm of work, the small, patient progress that came from shaping wood until it fit exactly where it belonged. Tess and I met most mornings at our workshop downtown. The place was simple, high ceilings, exposed beams, and a long workbench that smelled of pine and oil. She'd show up with coffee and her camera bag, already planning which projects we could feature in our new portfolio. "You realize the Hales house turned out to be your best advertisement," she said one morning, snapping photos of a reclaimed doorframe. "People love a redemption story." I smiled faintly, tightening a clamp on the edge of the table. "Let's just call it quality work," she grinned. "Whatever keeps you sane." Business was steady, almost too steady. Walt had referred 3 new clients, and one of them, a local developer, wanted to meet about a full restoration on a row of historic cottages along the river. I threw myself into it completely. The long hours didn't bother me. Every project felt like a new foundation being poured beneath my feet. At night, I'd return to my bungalow, the one I'd bought on Willamette Street, and work by lamplight, balancing invoices, sanding trim, or revarnishing the mantel I'd rescued from the old house. The quiet never felt lonely, but peace has its way of testing you. One Thursday morning, I came back from the job site to find my phone flashing with missed calls. Raymond Carver had left a message. "Diane and Lena have requested mediation regarding property assets. Please respond within the week." I sat on the porch steps listening to his voice again, slow and careful, the way he always spoke when he was trying not to alarm anyone. I called him back that afternoon. "They're pushing for a settlement," he said. "Your mother claims you removed fixtures that were considered part of the house." I glanced toward the mantel against my wall. "I took what I built," I said. "Nothing more." "I know," he replied gently, "but they're insisting on documentation. I'd like to see everything you've got before I file a response." I promised to send it that evening. That night, I spread the paperwork across my dining table, invoices, photos, copies of the email from Dad. The evidence looked plain enough, but the weight of it was something else entirely. I could see each decision in those numbers, every late-night purchase, every material choice made out of faith in a promise that hadn't been kept. I took a deep breath and scanned each file into a single folder labeled Proof Final Version. By Friday, Raymond had it all. "This is thorough, Nora," he said on the phone. "They'll have a hard time refuting it." Then after a pause, he added, "Robert's supporting your position fully. He's asked me to keep him updated." I didn't know what to say to that. After years of being background noise between my parents, he was finally standing on solid ground beside me. A few days later, I heard from him directly. He showed up at my workshop carrying a thermos of coffee and a stack of old blueprints. "I thought you could use these," he said, laying them out on the workbench. They were sketches of houses from the 1950s, his father's hand-drawn designs. He built for people who couldn't afford the fancy firms, Dad said softly. Said good work should last longer than the mortgage. He smiled faintly. "You've got that same stubborn streak." We worked side by side that morning, sorting through the drawings, labeling each one for archival storage. When he finally left, I realized the knot that had sat behind my ribs for months had loosened just a little. The following week, Raymond arranged the mediation at his office downtown. I wore a plain gray jacket and carried nothing but a small binder. Mom and Lena arrived together, both composed and quiet. Mark sat beside them, his briefcase open, notes stacked in careful piles. Raymond guided us through introductions, then gestured toward me. "Nora, you may begin." I opened the binder and slid the top document across the table. "This is a record of all materials purchased for the Hale property from 2022 to 2025, I said evenly. "Invoices, dates, and corresponding payments, all verified by third-party suppliers." Mark's eyes flicked over the pages. "We're aware," he said. "But Mrs. Hale contends that you benefited from living rent-free. That offsets the costs substantially." Raymond raised a hand. "We've reviewed that claim. The market value of her labor and materials still exceeds any implied offset." Mom leaned forward, her voice soft but steady. "I only wanted fairness. She made it sound like we took advantage, but that was never the intention." Her words might have convinced someone else, but her eyes didn't match her tone. I reached into the folder and pulled out the photographs Tess had prepared, before and after images of every space I'd restored. "This is what I built," I said quietly. "The property value increased by 43% after these renovations. I didn't live there for free. I worked there." Lena looked at the pictures without speaking. For the first time, she seemed unsure of her footing. Mark cleared his throat. "Given this, we might reconsider a percentage adjustment," he said. 15% is obviously no longer appropriate." He started scribbling numbers on his pad. Raymond leaned back, watching carefully. "I'd recommend you all take a moment," he said, standing to refill his coffee. The pause stretched. Mom glanced toward me. "Nora, she said you could walk away from this with something, or you could drag us through months of court filings. I don't want to see this family torn apart." I met her gaze. "It already is," I said simply. When Raymond returned, he summarized the updated terms: full reimbursement of my documented expenses, formal acknowledgement of my contribution in the property records, and closure of any future claims. I agreed. They did too, though no one looked entirely satisfied. Mark gathered the papers. Mom dabbed her eyes with a tissue, and Lena stood there twisting her wedding ring until it caught the light. Outside the office, the air was brisk, the sky clear for the first time in weeks. Dad was waiting near the curb, leaning against his car. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Fair," I said. He smiled a little. "That's all we can ask for." We didn't talk about Mom on the drive back, or about what fairness had cost each of us. We just rode in silence, the sound of the tires steady on the road. When he dropped me off at my bungalow, he turned to me before I got out. "You built more than a house, Nora," he said. "You built a way out." Then he drove away. That evening, Tess stopped by with takeout and a bottle of wine. We ate at my workbench, surrounded by sawdust and blueprints. "So what now?" she asked. I shrugged. "More work. Always more work." She laughed. "You're impossible." I smiled. "That's how things get built." Before she left, she paused in the doorway. "You know, she said most people would have folded when it got that ugly." "You didn't." I didn't have an answer, so I just nodded. After she was gone, I stood for a while in the quiet, listening to the creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of the heater. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the mantel I'd restored. The brass fittings caught the light, warm and bright against the wood. I ran my hand along its edge, feeling the smooth grain beneath my fingertips. Tomorrow, I'd meet with a new client about restoring the Fairview District homes. But for now, it was enough to stand there surrounded by the proof of everything I'd rebuilt. Outside, a thin layer of frost shimmered across the street. Somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck wood, a single steady rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. I poured a cup of coffee and watched the light climb the walls, steady and certain the way a new day always starts before the next change comes. The weeks after the settlement passed in a blur of quiet productivity, my workshop filled with the steady hum of machines and the sharp rhythmic tap of chisels. Every sound grounded me. I had more projects lined up than I could handle, alone restorations, cabinetry work, and consultations for the Fairview District renewal, but it wasn't the busy schedule that felt different. It was the space inside my life where chaos used to live, now replaced with something clean and solid. Dad called more often sometimes just to talk about small things, a new class he was teaching, a book he thought I might like, a recipe he'd tried and ruined. His voice sounded lighter, less burdened. I visited him for dinner one Friday evening at his new apartment downtown. The place was modest, full of sunlight and books, with a single fern sitting by the window that looked suspiciously well cared for. "You're settling in," I said. He smiled. "I had good help," he replied, nodding toward the framed photo on his shelf, one of us standing beside a half-finished porch. Mom hadn't reached out since the mediation. According to Raymond, she was finalizing the sale of the house to Lena, who planned to stay there with Mark. I didn't ask for details. Some things didn't need revisiting. Still, whenever I drove past the old neighborhood, I couldn't stop myself from glancing down that street just long enough to see the roof line against the sky. The paint looked a little duller now. By February, Tess and I had signed our biggest contract yet, a partnership with the Historical Society to restore several early-century homes for community use. It meant new hires, new materials, and more coordination than either of us had ever handled. Tess thrived in the chaos. I thrived in the structure. Together, we made it work. "You realize," she said one afternoon while sorting through invoices, "this is the kind of job that puts a company on the map." I nodded, marking up blueprints. "Let's make sure the work speaks louder than the name." A few days later, I was measuring floor joists when my phone buzzed. The number was familiar, but I couldn't place it until I heard the voice. "Nora, it's Lena." Her tone was careful, almost formal. "Mom's not well. She's been asking for you." I paused, pencil hovering above the page. "What happened?" "Stress, mostly," Lena said. "The move, the sale. It's been a lot. She doesn't have anyone else right now." That evening, I sat in my truck outside Mom's new apartment for a long time before knocking. She opened the door wearing a robe and a look of mild surprise, as if she hadn't believed I'd come. The place was smaller than I expected, tidy, but impersonal. The smell of lavender mixed with something faintly chemical. "You look tired," she said. "So do you," I replied. We sat at the kitchen table. She stirred a cup of tea, eyes fixed on the spoon. "You've built quite the business," she said finally. "Your father keeps telling everyone about it." Her voice carried a strange mix of pride and resentment. "He's been helping me with some of the financial planning," I said. I heard she replied, setting the spoon down. The silence between us felt like old wood, dry, cracked, ready to splinter. Then she surprised me. I was wrong about how I handled things. She said the words slow, deliberate. "About the promises, the way I spoke to you. I thought keeping everything in the family meant keeping control. It didn't." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. "Lena tells me you're doing a community project," she continued. "Your grandmother would have liked that. She used to say a home is only worth something if it gives back." I stayed for about an hour, long enough to help her fix a loose cabinet hinge and clear out a small stack of unopened mail. When I left, she stood in the doorway and said softly, "Don't be a stranger." The words sounded practiced, but the look in her eyes wasn't. Work picked up again fast after that. We were restoring an old community center downtown, peeling layers of paint off century-old beams, replacing windows warped by decades of moisture. It was messy, detailed, and deeply satisfying. Walt stopped by with fresh supplies and a grin. "You're getting good press," he said. "The local paper's running a story about your company next week." Tess laughed from across the room. "Guess you'll have to start smiling for photos now." The day the article came out, Dad dropped off a copy. The headline read, "Monroe Restoration Revives the Past Builds for the Future." My photo sat beside a quote about craftsmanship and community value. He looked proud in that quiet way of his, the kind that didn't need words. "Your mother saw it too," he said, setting the paper down. She called to tell me. I raised an eyebrow. That must have been an interesting conversation. He smiled faintly. Progress, Nora. It comes in small steps. By spring, I was spending most days traveling between job sites. The company had grown to a small crew, and each new project felt like a marker of how far I'd come. One morning, while preparing materials for a courthouse restoration, I got an email from Lena. She'd attached a photo of the old house, fresh paint-trimmed hedges, and a short message beneath it. The porch still feels like you. I stared at it for a long moment before replying with a simple, "Take care of it." Weeks later, as we finished the final phase of the Fairview project, the Historical Society invited me to speak at their annual event. It wasn't something I'd ever done before. Standing at a podium, looking out at a crowd of donors and builders, I felt oddly calm. Restoration isn't just about preserving wood or brick, I said. It's about honoring the hands that built them, even when history didn't. The applause came quietly, then grew. Afterward, a woman from the audience approached me. She introduced herself as Cynthia Ward, a board member overseeing grants for preservation programs. "Your story reminds me of why I started in this field," she said. "We're launching an initiative to teach restoration skills to young women. Would you consider leading it?" I shook her hand and said, "I'd think about it." That evening, I drove home through the dim glow of early spring light. The city felt softer, somehow the sharp edges of winter finally fading. When I pulled into my driveway, Dad's car was already there. He was waiting on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you might need company," he said. We sat outside as the sun set, the air carrying the scent of cut grass and cedar. "Mom called," he added. "She's thinking of visiting the Fairview site, said she wanted to see what you're building." I didn't answer right away. The past felt close again, but not heavy. "Maybe it's time," I said quietly. Maybe he agreed. Inside, the lights of my workshop glowed through the window, spilling across the wood grain of the table where new blueprints waited. Each line on the paper was clean and certain, no smudges, no crossed-out plans. For the first time in years, I could see the path forward without needing to rebuild what was behind me. Outside, the last light caught the edge of the tools hanging neatly on the wall, the same ones I once kept locked away for fear they'd disappear. Now they stood in plain sight, steady, familiar, waiting for the next foundation to rise. Spring turned to early summer, and the Fairview restoration wrapped ahead of schedule. The ribbon cutting was modest. Just a few local officials, volunteers, and neighbors gathered under the oak trees that shaded the renovated houses. Tess stood beside me, the corners of her notebook smudged with fingerprints and paint smiling as kids ran through the front gardens we'd rebuilt from cracked cement and weeds. The scent of lilac and sawdust hung in the warm air. When the ceremony ended, Cynthia Ward found me near the porch steps. "That was beautiful work," she said, her voice full of quiet certainty. "I meant what I said about the training initiative. The board approved funding for it this morning." She handed me a folder embossed with the Historical Society's seal. Inside was the outline for a 6-month program to teach restoration skills to women starting over single mothers, recent graduates, anyone trying to build a new trade. "You'd lead it," she continued. "Design the curriculum, teach the workshops, oversee projects. It's yours if you want it." The word "yours" caught in the air. I thanked her and promised to think about it, though I already knew my answer. That evening, after Tess and I loaded our tools, I drove home through the quiet streets, every turn of the wheel echoing with the same thought, that maybe what I'd built could finally give something back. Dad called that night. "Your mother asked about you again," he said. His tone was measured but not tense. "She's been calmer lately, reading more, volunteering at the library. I think she'd like to see you." I let the silence stretch before answering. "Maybe," I said. He didn't press. A week later, I agreed to meet her. We chose a cafe halfway between her apartment and my workshop. When I walked in, she was already seated near the window, her hair pulled back a paperback beside her teacup. She looked smaller, somehow, not frail, just quieter. "You look well," she said, standing briefly before sitting again. "So do you," I replied. The first few minutes were careful light talk about the weather, Dad's classes, Lena's new business venture. Then she folded her hands and looked straight at me. "I've been thinking about what happened," she said softly. "About the house, about how I treated you. I thought control was the same as care. It wasn't. Her voice trembled slightly. I hurt you. I know that. I studied her face, the way her expression flickered between guilt and resolve. For years I'd imagined hearing those words and how they might sound. Now they felt less like vindication and more like release. Thank you for saying that, I said quietly. It means something. She nodded. Your father tells me you're starting a program for women. He's very proud. We talked for nearly an hour. There were still gaps between us, wide and fragile, but for the first time they didn't feel impossible to cross. When we stood to leave, she reached for her purse, hesitated, and then placed a folded envelope on the table. It's not much, she said, but it's from the sale proceeds. You earned it. I looked at the envelope but didn't pick it up. That's between you and your conscience, I said gently. I have what I need. She gave a small, almost rueful smile. You really did learn to build everything yourself. Back at the workshop, Tess was waiting with blueprints spread across the table. You're glowing, she said, arching an eyebrow. Did something good happen? Or did you just sign another contract? I laughed softly. Maybe both. I told her about the training program, how we'd be using one of the Fairview homes as a teaching site. She grinned. So we're educators now. Guess I'll need to stop swearing around interns. In June, the program began. 5 women joined the first class, each with their own story, their own reason for being there. We started with simple restoration work, sanding, priming, installing new hardware. The sound of hammers and drills mixed with laughter, cautious at first, but growing freer with each week. There was something grounding about those afternoons, the rhythm of effort, the shared sense of progress. One evening after class, I lingered at the site finishing a window frame while the others packed up. The sun was low, slanting gold across the floorboards. Dad appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of lemonade. Cynthia told me you're a natural teacher, he said, handing me one. I just tell them what I wish someone had told me, I replied. He looked around the room, his gaze soft. Your grandmother would have been proud. She used to say, legacy isn't what you leave, it's what you teach. We sat together on the steps outside, watching the light fade. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he said, Your mother and I finalized the divorce last week. She's moving closer to Lena. It's been civil, all things considered. I nodded, unsure what to say. I just wanted you to hear it from me, he added, and to tell you that you handled everything with more grace than either of us deserved. Later that night, I walked through my bungalow, turning off lights one by one until only the glow from my workshop remained. The mantel gleamed softly in the lamplight, its surface smooth from countless passes of sandpaper. I traced my fingers along the grain the same way I had when I first built it. Every line told a story of what was taken, what was repaired, and what was made new. The next morning, Tess and I met Cynthia at the community center to discuss expansion. The board wanted to add 2 more houses to the program. You'll need a bigger team, Cynthia said, glancing at the plans. Think you're ready for that? I nodded. We are. That afternoon, I walked the Fairview street one more time. The houses stood solid now, windows, bright gardens alive with color. A few neighbors waved from their porches. It felt like the town itself had exhaled. When I reached the end of the block, I paused to look back. For a long time, that street had represented everything I'd lost: time, family belonging. Now it was something else entirely, proof of what endurance could build. The phone rang as I unlocked my truck. It was Lena. Hey, she said, her voice softer than I remembered. Mom told me about the program. It sounds incredible. Maybe one day you can help us restore the old barn on the property. I smiled to myself. Maybe I said, when you're ready. When I hung up, the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the street. I stayed there a while, listening to the sound of distant laughter, the faint hum of a power saw from another project nearby. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the one I'd built steady, honest, and mine. As I drove home, the first stars began to appear over the hills. Tomorrow I'd meet the new trainees and start drawing plans for their first build. The tools waited on the wall ready. Each one carried the weight of what had come before, but none of it felt heavy anymore. It felt like strength, the kind that comes quietly after the noise has faded. And for the first time in years, I wasn't looking back. I was building forward. The summer after the Fairview project ended felt lighter than any season before it. Each morning, sunlight spilled across the workshop floor, catching the fine dust in the air like gold. The women from our first training group had all found steady work, some with local builders, one even starting her own refinishing business. Their success reminded me how far we'd all come from those first uncertain days with mismatched gloves and borrowed tools. I still visited the Fairview homes, often tightening a loose hinge or checking that the gardens were growing. Every time I saw something new, a fresh coat of paint, a wind chime, a child's drawing taped to a window, the work had taken on a life of its own. Cynthia stopped by one afternoon with news that the Historical Society wanted to feature our program at their annual awards dinner. I laughed when she said it. "You're the one who made this happen," I told her. She shook her head. "No, Nora. You did. You took something painful and turned it into purpose." That night, I thought about what she said while sketching plans for our next site. Maybe she was right. What had started as a fight for fairness had grown into something bigger than any single house. Dad came to visit a few days later, carrying a box of old photographs. He spread them across the table, black and white prints of my grandparents standing in front of the house they built after the war. They did every bit of it by hand, he said, tapping a photo where my grandmother leaned on a shovel, smiling. "She'd be proud of what you're doing now." I smiled back at him. I think she'd say, "I just used better tools." He laughed, the kind of laugh that filled a room instead of cutting through it. Not long after, I got a call from Lena. "Mom wants to come to the awards dinner," she said hesitantly. She asked if it would be all right. I paused before answering. "Of course," I said. "It's open to anyone who helped build something worth keeping." When the evening arrived, the banquet hall glowed with soft lights and polished oak. Tess sat on one side of me, Dad on the other. When I saw Mom walk in with Lena, I felt something loosen in my chest. She looked nervous, but smiled when our eyes met, and for the first time in years, that smile didn't hide a transaction. During the ceremony, Cynthia took the podium to introduce the award. She spoke about craft and heritage, about how preservation is as much about people as it is about places. Then she called my name. The applause rose steady and warm, but all I could hear was the sound of saws and laughter from the workshop, the real proof of what we'd built together. I thanked everyone, my hands trembling slightly on the microphone. Homes, I said, aren't just walls or roofs. They're stories we keep alive through care. And sometimes the hardest repairs are the ones we make inside ourselves. When it was over, people mingled, clinking glasses and sharing stories. Mom approached slowly, holding a folded program. "You spoke beautifully," she said. "Your grandmother would have been proud." I smiled. So would she. She nodded, eyes glistening. "Thank you for letting me be here." I didn't have the right words, so I just touched her hand. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't need ceremony, it just needs space to exist. That night, after everyone had gone, I drove home through quiet streets. The moonlight traced silver lines across the dashboard. I passed the old Hale house without meaning to slow down, but I did. The porch light was on. Through the window, I could see Lena and Mark moving furniture, laughing about something small. The sight didn't sting anymore. It felt like watching a story finish its course. Back at my bungalow, I walked into the workshop. The tools hung neatly on their hooks, the air faintly sweet from fresh varnish. On the wall above my desk, I'd framed one of Dad's old photographs, the one of my grandmother with her shovel. Beneath it, I'd carved a small plaque that read, "Build what lasts." I sat for a while listening to the crickets outside, thinking about everything that had changed. I no longer measured worth in promises kept or approval earned, but in what could stand upright when the storm passed. Some lessons take years to learn. Others reveal themselves only when the noise quiets. If there's one thing I know now, it's this. No one can give you solid ground. You have to build it yourself, one careful layer at a time. And sometimes, if you're patient, even the ones who hurt you will learn to build something stronger too. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that rebuilding is always possible and that every foundation, no matter how cracked, can still hold.